They say that money can't buy happiness, but it can certainly buy the power to make another human being invisible. I was standing on the curb of Fifth Avenue, the freezing October rain soaking through my thin jacket, watching my life's work get tossed into a puddle. A single yellow paper was taped to the glass of the lobby door, an eviction notice signed by a man who had never even looked me in the eye. Elias Thorne, the billionaire landlord they called the Ice King, was clearing out the building to make room for condos that cost more than I'd earn in a lifetime. He didn't care that I had nowhere to go. To him, I wasn't a person. I was just a decimal point he was moving to the left. I looked up, squinting through the downpour, and saw him. He was standing on his private penthouse balcony, shielded by a glass overhang, looking down at the street like a god surveying a wasteland. I wanted to scream, but the cold had stolen my voice. Instead, I reached for the one thing I had managed to save from my apartment, a small, moth-eaten velvet pouch. As I pulled it out, my fingers slipped. The silver locket inside hit the wet pavement with a sharp crack, the hinge snapping under the pressure. It popped open in the mud. I knelt down to grab it, but I froze. In the dim glow of the street lamp, the face of the woman in the tiny portrait stared back at me. She had my high cheekbones. She had my exact, deep-set eyes. And on her neck was a diamond necklace with the Thorne family crest. I looked back up at the balcony, my heart hammering against my ribs. The man who just made me homeless wasn't just my landlord. He was the man in the photo standing right next to her. I stood there for a heartbeat too long, the mud seeping into my jeans, staring at a face that was both a stranger's and my own. I didn't care about the boxes anymore. I didn't care about the rain. I stood up, gripped that broken locket so hard the silver bit into my palm, and marched back toward the heavy oak doors of the Thorne Plaza. The security guard, a man named Miller who usually looked at me with pity, stepped out to block my path. "Clara, you know the rules. Once the notice is up, you're out. I can't let you back in." "Look at me, Miller," I whispered, my voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and adrenaline. I wiped the wet hair from my forehead and stood directly under the harsh, bright lights of the lobby. Miller's hand, reaching for his radio, stopped midair. His eyes darted from me to the massive, 10-foot oil painting hanging behind the marble reception desk, the memorial of Elias Thorne. The lobby went deathly silent. Miller's flashlight slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the stone floor. He didn't say a word. He just backed away, his face pale as a ghost. I didn't wait for his permission. I turned toward the private elevator banks just as the gold doors slid open. Out stepped the Ice King himself. Elias Thorne looked exactly like he did on the balcony, cold, untouchable, and wrapped in a $3,000 wool coat. He opened his mouth to bark an order at security to have me removed, but then his eyes met mine. The air left his lungs in a sharp, audible wheeze. He looked at my face, then his eyes dropped to the shattered locket in my hand. For the first time in his life, the King of New York looked terrified. If you want to see the moment this billionaire realizes he just threw his own daughter into the gutter, smash that like button and subscribe. The silence in the lobby was heavy enough to crush a person. Elias Thorne stared at me, his hand gripping the handle of his leather briefcase so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a man who had seen the dead rise from the marble floor. "Who put you up to this?" he hissed, his voice a jagged blade. "Is it the rival firms? Did they find a lookalike to play on my grief?" He was shaking, though he tried to hide it by adjusting his coat. He grabbed my arm, not with warmth but with the desperation of a man trying to prove a ghost isn't real, and pulled me into his private office. The walls were lined with dark oak and cold achievements, but all I could see was the small silver locket sitting on his desk between us. "I buried that locket with my wife," he whispered, his eyes darting between the jewelry and my face. "This is a sick joke. You're a squatter, a tenant who couldn't pay her bills, and now you're trying to con a grieving man." I didn't flinch. I let the silence hang until the air felt thin. Then, slowly, I reached for the button of my damp cardigan. I pulled the collar back just enough to reveal my collarbone and the top of my shoulder. Right there, etched into my skin like a constellation, was a deep, star-shaped birthmark. Elias gasped, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. He stumbled back, hitting his mahogany chair. "Elena told me," he breathed, his voice breaking. "She said our daughter had a star to guide her back home if she ever got lost. But they told me the fire took you. They told me you were ashes." The Ice King was melting, and in the puddle stood a father who had just realized he'd spent years trying to destroy his own heart. The room shifted from a confrontation to a crime scene in an instant. Elias didn't call security, he called his longtime family attorney, Harrison Vane. When Vane walked in, his polished exterior cracked the second he saw me standing by the window. He didn't ask who I was, he asked Elias why the problem hadn't been removed yet. That was his first mistake. The second was the way his eyes kept darting to the safe in the corner. Elias wasn't a fool. He hadn't built an empire by ignoring red flags. "Harrison," Elias said, his voice returning to that terrifying low vibration. "Tell me again about the hospital fire 22 years ago. Tell me how you personally verified the death certificates while I was sedated with grief." Vane started to sweat, his hand trembling as he adjusted his silk tie. He spoke about protocols and tragic accidents, but the more he talked, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to click. My mother hadn't died of natural causes, and I hadn't been lost. I had been erased from the Thorne lineage to ensure the inheritance stayed within the reach of the board of directors. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the office, we heard a commotion outside. I looked down from the penthouse window and saw a black SUV idling at the curb. Two men in dark suits were rummaging through my soaked cardboard boxes on the sidewalk, tossing my clothes aside as they searched for something specific. They weren't looking for valuables, they were looking for my original adoption papers. Elias saw it too. He picked up the phone, and for the first time he wasn't calling an eviction crew. He was calling a private security team. "Protect the girl," he commanded, "and bring me Vane's head on a platter." The DNA results arrived via secure courier at 2:00 a.m., the digital seal glowing blue in the dark office. 99.9% match. The paper didn't just confirm my bloodline, it signed the death warrant for the lies Elias had lived by for 2 decades. I watched him read it, his eyes scanning the page over and over as if he could rewrite the last 3 years of my life. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and I saw the crushing weight of every pay or quit notice he'd ever sent me. He had been the monster in my nightmares, and now he was the father in my reality. "I made you sleep in a room with a broken heater," he whispered, his voice thick with a regret that no amount of money could fix. "I let you walk through the rain while I sat in the dry." He turned toward Harrison Vane, who was now backed into a corner, trapped between the billionaire he'd betrayed and the truth he'd tried to bury. Elias didn't shout. He didn't have to. The quiet rage in his eyes was far more terrifying. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, gold-embossed folder, the master deed to Thorne Plaza. In a move that stunned even the lawyers in the room, Elias grabbed a pen and crossed out his own name. He wrote mine in its place. "You wanted to turn this building into luxury condos for the elite, Harrison," Elias sneered. "Well, the new owner has a different plan." He handed me the pen and a set of keys that felt like they weighed a ton. "You were a tenant yesterday, Clara. Today, you are the landlord. And your first order of business is to decide what we do with the man who stole 20 years from us." I looked at Vane, then at the keys, realizing that the greatest revenge wasn't taking his money, it was taking his world. The transition from a girl with a leaking cardboard box to the woman who owned the skyscraper didn't happen with a party, it happened with a signature. I didn't sell the building, and I didn't turn it into a fortress. Instead, I stood on that same penthouse balcony where Elias once looked down at me, but I wasn't looking at the street. I was looking at Harrison Vane as he was escorted out of the lobby in handcuffs, his elite reputation dissolving into a front-page scandal. He didn't just lose his career, Elias ensured every asset Vane had ever touched was frozen for investigation. Justice was served cold, but for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the thermostat. Elias stayed. He didn't ask for his office back. He spent his days sitting in the lobby, watching the construction crews he'd hired, not to build condos, but to renovate the entire lower wing into a state-of-the-art shelter and advocacy center for displaced families. He was a man trying to buy back his soul, one brick at a time. We shared dinners in a silence that was no longer icy, but tentative. He was my father, yes, but he was also a stranger I was learning to forgive. He gave me my mother's private diary, a leather-bound book that smelled like old lilies and sea salt. It was my inheritance, far more valuable than the marble under my feet. The story felt finished. The villain was in a cell, the father was redeemed, and the daughter was a queen. But as I sat in the penthouse late one night, reading the very last page of my mother's diary, the ink began to blur under my tears. The final entry wasn't a poem or a goodbye. It was a frantic, shaky note written just hours before the fire that supposedly took me. It read, "They think I only have one. They don't know about the second star." I sent him to the valley where the thorn crest cannot reach. I looked at my birthmark in the mirror, my single star. My blood ran cold. If I was the star that stayed in the sky, who was the star hidden in the valley? I had found my father, but I had a brother out there who didn't even know he was a king.